I want to talk with you, invite you into a conversation about the last book of our Bibles, about what we call the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus Christ according to John. And it's going to be part of a fall Bible study series we're going to be offering both in person on Tuesdays this fall and also with video supplements like this. But in order to get there, today I want to actually ask you to think with me about Dr. Seuss, and in particular about a part of Dr. Seuss's life and work that maybe you didn't know about. Before he wrote such classics as Green Eggs and Ham or The Cat in the Hat or my personal favorite Horton Hears a Who, Dr. Seuss, Theodore Seuss Geisel, was a political cartoonist, wrote editorial cartoons during the early 1940s. In other words, when the world was engulfed in World War II, and especially in the era just before the United States entered the war. I discovered a few years ago by coming across this book, edited by Richard Minier, about exactly this era, and I was floored to discover that the person who created such great characters as the Cat in the Hat or the Sneetches or the Grinch Who Stole Christmas had also drawn political cartoons, editorial cartoons, and it turns out reading this and learning some of Seuss's editorial cartoons has helped give me a whole new window into how to understand the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. I know those seem like they are worlds apart, right? Written like 19 centuries apart, completely different formats, very, very different styles, but there's something really, really important that has been a really big help for me to understand how we approach a book like the book of Revelation. And it has everything to do with the same way we automatically know how to read a form like a political cartoon. Let's start with how political cartoons work. Whether it's the politics of our era or of a different era, political cartoonists, editorial cartoonists, have a way of using images as a shorthand. Right? The idea is with a simple, powerful image, you can convey a lot of meaning, but it requires the people who are reading the cartoon to understand what the symbols and images mean, right? Otherwise, you got to have a whole bunch of footnotes to your editorial cartoon explaining this symbolizes this symbolizes that. But an editorial cartoonist learns sort of a shorthand, symbols that would have made sense to their original readers, so that even if we live in a different time and place, maybe it takes a little bit of a learning curve and a little bit of background knowledge, but we can place ourselves kind of in the mindset of Seuss's original readers to understand what the point of what he's saying is. So in Dr. Seuss's editorial cartoons of the first half of 1941, this is leading up to before the United States enters into World War II, one of Seuss's recurring themes is the United States couldn't just watch the rest of the world burn down as the Nazi war machine took over. Seuss's perspective was you had to take sides. And part of his goal in drawing the particular cartoons he drew was that there are times in life where you have to choose. You can't just sit on the fence and look only out for you or hunker down and pretend. You have to acknowledge the monstrosity of, say, the Nazi war machine, and you have to say, no, we can't let that continue. We have to resist. We can't just let Hitler run over all of Europe or conquer the world or what have you. And to get that idea across, that recurring idea, Seuss uses the basic tropes of how a political cartoon works. He'll draw a situation and assume we all understand that the images he's working with are trying to convey a message, and that, so often, is the recurring idea. So let me show you one that is dated May 27, 1941. This is 6 months before we enter World War II after Pearl Harbor. You've got a guy sitting in a bathtub, and he represents sort of an American point of view. His hat says America first. There was this mentality in those days that Americans, we had to look out only for our interests and not help, say, the people of Poland who were being conquered or the people of North Africa who were being overrun by Mussolini. We had to only look out for ourselves. So here's this guy in the bathtub who says, America first, I'm perfectly safe here in the family bathtub, but the bathtub is full of all sorts of dangerous creatures, an octopus and a shark and a crocodile and a scorpion or a lobster, all kinds of creatures, and you'll notice they're all marked with the swastika, right? So this is a pretty blunt message, right? You might think that you're safe because nothing can harm you, but you're in a bathtub full of dangerous creatures. the message pretty simple. Even if they haven't started to bite you yet, they're going to come for you, and you can't have that naive perspective of, we only look out for me and my group first. Now, without this trying to be any particular person, that's not supposed to represent any particular individual person, and this isn't supposed to necessarily represent any one person in the Nazi war machine, but that whole way of thinking, that whole system of thinking, the image gets that across pretty clearly. Now, another one will do the trick nicely too. Here he's got that same idea of America first and ridiculing it by having that perspective sort of joined at the beard with someone clearly wearing a swastika representing all the evil of the Nazi war machine. Because again, the idea was, there were some folks who said, look, we just can't take sides, we only got to look out for ours first, doesn't matter what happens to other people in the world, we got to look out for us first. America first was their sort of recurring refrain, their chant, their motto. And Seuss's point is to say, that's just a kissing cousin away from actually supporting the Nazi war machine. You can't say that knowing that it's going to mean the rest of the world gets burned down by Hitler. The idea is pretty simple and pretty clear. Now, he's not actually claiming that there are people who are joined at the beard, and he's not actually trying to represent any particular historical, literal person, but he's trying to suggest something about the very literal, very real perspective that was out there in the world in which Seuss lived. One more I think might be helpful here. Here you've got a symbol with a particular meaning. You've got Seuss drawing the American eagle looking at himself in the mirror and discovering that he's not as virile and strong and bold and courageous, he's kind of decrepit and sad looking. Seuss does something that any good editorial cartoonist knows how to do. You take stock images or symbols that everybody already knows that are floating in the national consciousness, and you use them in a new way. So Seuss didn't come up with the idea to represent the United States with an eagle. He, however, has taken that image that everybody already knew and says, how am I going to play with that? Instead of this being the strong, bold, courageous eagle that everybody wants to imagine, I'm going to draw us as this decrepit, sad, old, cowardly eagle, and when he looks in the mirror, he can see that truth about himself. I want us to be clear that whether it's Dr. Seuss, in the 1940s, or John of Patmos 2,000 years ago, they knew there are times where to get through to the people you're trying to reach, you can use the images, the symbols, the references that people already around you will understand, and you have to do that in a way that is simple and clear if you're trying to persuade people, especially if you're trying to awaken people out of complacency. If there are people who are sort of taking this position of, well, I don't really have to worry about the troubles going on somewhere else, or I'm just going to hunker down and pretend that I can't take sides, sometimes you need voices like Seuss's, or like John of Patmos, waking people up and saying, no, we have to be a participant in what's going on around us. We have to speak up. And sometimes there are clear lines between the powers of evil and the powers of good, and how they accomplish their goals as well. It was really easy in the early 1940s, before Pearl Harbor Day, to say, we don't have to care about other people's needs. It doesn't affect me. We got to look out for my group first. And if it doesn't affect me, let's ignore it. So one final cartoon. Seuss has this sort of grandmotherly figure reading a story, a bedtime story to children about Adolf the Wolf. Again, pretty heavy-handed and pretty clear. Adolf the Wolf, that's Hitler. But notice the woman who looks like this pleasant, sweet grandma lady is wearing the America First motto, and what she says to her children, who she's reading, the wolf chewed up the children and spit out their bones, but those were foreign children and it didn't really matter. I mean, again, pretty clear, blunt, direct, shocking message. But Seuss is convinced, in his time, you have to speak up. You have to be clear in times like that to get through to people, especially people who were wanting to stick their heads in the sand. Another stock image that Seuss would use in this time. Now, we're not trying to have a conversation about how we should or shouldn't have fought World War II. That story is played out. But what I want to ask you to consider is the same way that an editorial cartoonist like Dr. Seuss in this era used images and symbols, sometimes not with a lot of nuance, but with real sharp clarity, and sometimes in very stark black and white, day and night, good versus evil kind of terms. The book of Revelation does the same way, and does so in order to awaken people not only in John's day, certainly in our day as well, but to realities that were all around them at the time. Sometimes we come at the stories and the images and the symbols in the book of Revelation, and we treat them like John intends us to believe there are actual sea monsters that will arise up out of the water, or actual eagles or creatures with weird features or things like that. When John is using the same kind of stock imagery that would have been obvious to everybody in his day, the same way in our day in 2021 or in 1941, 80 years ago, Seuss could say, here's an eagle with a hat with stars and stripes on its head, and everybody knows, oh, that's clearly meant to represent the United States, right? You can have a monster with tentacles that looks like an octopus, put a swastika on it, everybody knows, oh, that's supposed to represent Nazi Germany and its approach to dominating the world. You don't have to label everything. Some of those symbols just come through. Now, to my kids, if they happen across this, go, oh, Dr. Seuss, let me look at this. They won't understand. They don't know that history yet. In elementary school, I'm glad they're spared knowing all the details of the horrors of World War II at this point. So someone needs to unpack for them what would have been obvious to Seuss, and maybe to you and me who know a little bit about American history or world history might know more obviously. I want to suggest as we delve into the book of Revelation, number one, we're going to need to do some of that historical unpacking. There's going to be symbols and images that John assumed his readers understood, and that if we don't, it's not that John is wrong, or that John can't have meant something obvious to his people that we don't understand, but maybe we need to do some research and learning. Things that would have been obvious to John's readers, we need to get up to speed with them on. Number two, the same way that an editorial cartoon might speak very immediately to a situation that the cartoonist is dealing with right then and there, and then also have ways of meaning something for people later on. I want to suggest the book of Revelation works something like that. It meant something very clear, very urgent to the first readers who lived in the late 1st century, early 2nd century. They understood the images and symbolism as a way of undercutting the power of the Roman Empire and saying that God's way of reigning is different, and that over against the empire that seems like it wins the day and is inevitable and eternal and invincible, no, there's this other way that God's victory comes, and the other empires of the world will eventually crumble. That was essential news to hear, especially for people in John's day who weren't really sure if they should stick their necks out and admit that they were followers of Jesus. It was getting more and more dangerous to name the name of Jesus in the 1st century. You know, more of our conversations will talk about why, but it has, in a sense, everything to do with saying that Caesar doesn't get the last say on things, that empire isn't the final word, but in fact God reigns and rules over the world through suffering love, through a cross and resurrection that looks like a lamb rather than a monster or a wolf or even a lion. That's an important thing for people in John's day who weren't sure if the strategy should just be let's hide our heads in the sand. But it also is important for us too. Even though the Roman Empire isn't around anymore, there's still this ongoing impulse to rule the world that way, to use power that way in domination or coercion and violence. And the followers of Jesus are called to be this very different way of living in the world. What John originally had in mind with a particular empire, particular set of symbols, and even particular people, an emperor, and particular policies, has meaning for us today, but we can't forget this meant something to the first people who read it and experienced it. The same way I can appreciate a book of political cartoons from 80 years ago, even though it's not an option today, whether we do or don't go fight in World War II. That's come and gone. Sometimes we Christians make this crucial blunder in reading the book of Revelation. We assume, sometimes implicitly, sometimes we just say it out loud, that it meant nothing for the first, 1,500 years, 2,000 years of history, until we get to our era, and now it just starts to mean things. And it's tempting to say, here's what's happening in the headlines. This must have been a prediction for the thing happening in my lifetime. When I think that misses the point and actually distorts what John's trying to do. Instead of saying, the book of Revelation meant nothing for a very, very long time, but only in our era does it start to have meaning or its symbols have references. maybe we should read it the other way around and assume it meant something for John's hearers, that when John talks about an eagle figure, they didn't go, oh, I wonder if there's going to be a country called the United States one day that will be like that. I wonder if maybe more it's, oh, that's like the Roman eagle that was all over their banners and symbols and emblems. That maybe this meant something in the first century. And if we want to figure out what it means for us today, we have to first go, what did this mean for its original readers? And then, how do we unpack what it means for us today? In a similar way, Seuss's cartoons had one particular message for their time. And it doesn't mean that just because we've left that period and World War II is over now, it doesn't mean that these are meaningless, but we can't immediately make the leap and go, oh, well, this book and this cartoon tells me we should go start in another war, or X, Y, or Z conflict. We can't immediately make that leap, that whatever was going on then we must duplicate in our era. Maybe the point, the driving point, the common thread is we can't ignore the needs of other people just because they aren't like me or from my country. But we are connected to each other, and we can't just turn a blind eye or stick our heads in the sand in the face of other people's suffering. That seems like a fair point, and an appropriate way of understanding what Seuss's cartoon from a long time ago might mean again today. I want to invite you into this kind of exploration, because I'm convinced that John, the writer of Revelation, speaks a word that absolutely means something important and vital for us, and so often we're the ones who are complacent and apathetic and don't want to be involved in the difficulty or messiness of the world. And the more and more I read the book of Revelation, the more I'm convinced that's at the heart of its message. It's about waking us up if we're complacent and have fallen asleep. That like any good prophet, John's job is both to comfort the afflicted and to afflict the comfortable. And if we find ourselves tempted to sort of slide into something that's awfully easy or comfortable and not challenging, John's job, just like Seuss's job, is to wake us up and shake us up to see things maybe we didn't want to have to face up to. Sometimes you have to use pretty stark, blunt imagery to do that. There is, to be sure, a time and a place for nuance and balance and discovering shades of gray. Lutheran Christians are great at that, at embracing, well, this, but on the other hand, this. We love and relish paradox in all sorts of other ways. Sometimes you can do that, but other times there's got to be clarity. We can't be a participant in evil. We have to be able to speak up against the powers of empire. We're called to be people who give our allegiance to Jesus, the Lamb, rather than to Caesar, the Emperor. Those kinds of things. And sometimes we need a voice as surprising and jarring and urgent as John of Patmos, who's kind of given us a book of editorial cartoons in the last book of the Bible, the book we call Revelation. I want to invite you to join us in this kind of conversation coming up this fall as we take a look at the book of Revelation in a series we're calling Lamb Power. Check it out coming this fall.